Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. I feel like we should start with a big sigh, like that. Maybe a frustrated one. But we're here because we do sense and we do know that it seems like the one thing that people agree on across all kinds of divides is that we do not seem to know how to talk to each other across disagreement. If you were at the plenary session this morning, you heard Ayanna say that America aspires to be the best democracy in the world. And the president of the University of Chicago followed on by saying, the heartbeat of a democracy is deliberative dialogue across disagreement. De Tocqueville, way back in the day, wrote about how American patriotism is different. They want to fight. They want to disagree. That's the way America does things. So how can we meet those aspirations if we are in this stuck place where it seems like we cannot talk to each other? And so we're here to talk about that, but more importantly, we're here to talk about how things might improve, what strategies exist, and what each of us maybe can do. So I'm really excited to be joined by these two incredible thinkers and researchers in the space. So we have Peter Coleman, a social psychologist and researcher in conflict resolution and peace studies based at Columbia University. And we have Deb Roy, the director of the Center for Constructive Communication at MIT and CEO of Cortico, which is out to bring unheard voices to the center of a stronger public dialogue. And I did not introduce myself, sorry. I'm Mónica Guzmán. I'm Senior Fellow for Public Practice at Braver Angels, which is the largest cross-partisan grassroots organization working to depolarize America. So, I want to open really broadly, and I hope we can have a dynamic conversation here with the subject of this talk. Can we talk to each other? So where does your mind go? Where does your hope go? And I'll start with Peter.
Thank you very much. Welcome, everybody. So I am mostly a scientist. I run a couple of research centers at Columbia. I'm also a mediator, so I get involved in practice as well. So I try to think about science that's practical. And so that's the primary lens or role I'll have in this conversation, is to try to bring empirical science to bear on this problem. So the question is, can we learn to talk to each other across our differences? Of course we can, right? We've done this before. People do this everywhere. We learn this in some ways in kindergarten. But it depends on the differences that we're talking about. And it depends on the context. So I'm a social psychologist, so I'm interested in how people communicate and work their differences out. But I'm also interested in the situations that they're in. And what I will say is that, so yes, we can talk to each other across even extreme differences today. The question is, does it matter? And will it stick? Right? Will it have an impact on us and on them? And will it ultimately move the needle? And I think the problem context that we're in is we've just come from a session on wicked problems. The toxic polarization of America today is a wicked problem. It is, by some counts, by some measures, a 60-year increasing trajectory of animosity and hate and contempt for across red and blue Americans. This depends on what you're measuring, but if you look back in terms of just Congress's capacity to work together, it's been getting worse and worse, more and more obstructionism, really since the 1970s. And that's also true, many of us feel a sense of contempt and outrage for them. So this is a complicated problem. It is a wicked problem, and it's not something that will be fixed by a conversation, right? It's not something I can fix or you can fix because it's bigger than us. However, how we speak to each other can make a difference in starting to move us in a different direction. So that's really what we want to talk about here today. This is what Karl Popper, a philosopher of science, called a cloud problem. These are not things that are amenable to simple fixes. So we can't just say, okay, my brother-in-law is insane, but I'll give it a shot. I'll try to sit down and talk to him, because guess what? If you kind of wander into those conversations, you know where they're going to go. So I think the trick is to find a strategy that And my inclination is to stay close to the science. One of the things that many Americans try to do these days, and many bridge building groups try to do, is just get together with somebody from the other side and have a beer or a cup of coffee and a conversation. The bad news is that the majority of those conversations backfire, and we leave them feeling more estranged and more frustrated from the other side. So that's based on something called contact theory, which was developed in the 1950s, mostly about race relations, that it's helpful when people from different groups get together and have an experience of each other under certain conditions. And so that's what we have to understand is, what are the conditions where those conversations can actually be helpful and fruitful and move us and teach us a little bit about them and a little bit about these complex issues that we're oversimplifying, but more importantly, a little bit about ourselves. How do we get into conversations with others across these differences that allow us to discover and learn? One of the distinctions I make very clearly is the difference between debate and dialogue. Debate is something that we're all socialized to do. I was trained in debate in high school. We see it in politics. We see it on Law and Order. Everywhere we look, right, there is this debate format. And we assume that talking to people who are different from us should take the form of debate. I suggest that's usually wrong, right? That we have to start somewhere else. And where we would start is something that we call dialogue. Dialogue is simply telling stories. Who are you? Where do you come from? What's your upbringing? Like, why is this important issue, this issue important to you? And who am I? Right? And oftentimes, if you start there and get a sense of the humanity, the soul of the other, right, then it can become possible to move into political discussions and disagreements and even debate. But you have to have what John Gottman, who is a marital therapist, says, you got to have a reservoir of positivity. You have to have some rapport and trust, right, that exists there. Sometimes that happens from third parties, like Braver Angels. We'll have facilitators and ground rules, and that helps us talk to each other. But dialogue is a critical beginning phase before you get into politics. And my feeling is just telling people to get, like a pro-Trump and anti-Trump or get together is unethical these days, because this problem it's what we call a biopsychosocial structural problem.
Whoa.
Yeah. Well, so addiction is considered by scientists a biopsychosocial structural problem. So it's in our biology, it's in our neurology, the information we process and don't process. It's in our psychology, right? How our beliefs, our values. It's in our networks of people that we do talk to and don't talk to. It's in our social networks, right? The media and the algorithms that sort us. It's in the mainstream media that we watch and don't watch. It's in places we go to vacation or don't go to vacation, right? So there are these multiple structures that are working to essentially pull Americans apart. That's why it's been happening for 60 years. It's not Donald Trump, it's not gerrymandering, it's not any one of these things. It's how they work together in some cultural way to really pull us apart and pit us against each other, sometimes by conflict entrepreneurs, actors that are intentionally using these conflicts for their own gain. But sometimes these systems take on a life of their own, and that's what we've seen in war-torn nations, is these things get beyond us, and then we can't control them. The good news is that our country is in a place where we can do something about it. We can make a difference. 87% of us are just exhausted and fed up. That's good news. It's good to be miserable, America. You need to have a sense of being fed up, and then you need to know what to do next, what else to do, and that's what we want to focus on.
Yeah, absolutely. Yep. So let's bring Deb in. So can we talk to each other? How do you come at that?
Well, good morning, everyone. Thanks for joining us today. I'll just say a couple of words about the two organizations, and then that sort of forms my lens into this complex, multifaceted issue. So the Center for Constructive Communication is a research center where we have spent the last 15 years studying social media and using it both as a channel to listen to people, and more recently studying the characteristics of social media as a kind of space in fact, such an important space that when you think about most of what you know about the world and about others that you don't have direct contact with, that is formed by some kind of a mediating influence. The media and social media, which have become completely entangled, is the environment that shapes most of our understanding of our world. And it's very difficult to, kind of like it's hard for fish to know they're wet. It's hard for us to step out of that environment and be able to reflect on what is it that is informing our opinions, our beliefs, that create these filters that when we go into the world, whether it's in the fight or in the debate or a stranger passing us in an airport or on the street, the kind of assumptions we hold about that person are being shaped by this meeting environment. So this is something that we study. And more recently, over the last few years, we have shifted from studying to saying, let's actually take a positive view of the kind of spaces we'd like that can actually move away from fake and performative to real and authentic, and leverage technology to build alternatives. Some of you might have been at the Spark talk. Actually, we both spoke yesterday about some of the ideas of the skills that people need to acquire, and I talked about the potential for using technology to create spaces that are designed to support these kinds of skills. So that's sort of the lens that I bring to this, and I do think that there are multiple factors, and so the lens that I'm bringing is thinking about these spaces and how they are actually kind of all-encompassing, right? And it's very difficult actually to do that step out, to think about how that's affecting us. So I think the answer to the question of the session is, yes, we can learn how to speak with one another, but we need the skills, but we need the spaces where we can actually practice and actually form habits. And we need to bring those habits into our civic and political life in places where they can actually have impact. So so one of the concerns I have about just focusing on the skills is that often it takes an enormous amount of energy to bring people into a context where they can then apply those skills, and the moment you take that energy back, everything collapses, right? And so some of the challenges around how do we create those contexts that are sustainable, and here I think there's another skill set that becomes important in terms of how we learn to speak with one another and have it stick and have those spaces become more enduring, which is, we the people need to learn how to create those spaces and actually take active roles in maintaining them. So that's in general.
And that's already a theme in what you were saying. You were saying there's something feels wrong, irresponsible with just contact theory. Just throw people together and see what happens. And you're saying, yeah, there's something about the context. If people bring that energy in, then how do you know that you have the right ingredients at the table to make it work? So one thing I want to bring up is, I think we all sense this. One of the things that can get in the way is performance, where we are so divided and siloed that we want to score points with what we say. So what are the ingredients of a space that puts us in the right direction where performance doesn't come ahead of something more constructive?
One thing just to clarify, the idea of contact theory is more than just bringing people into contact, but it's actually having some kind of a shared goal.
That's right.
A problem-solving goal, for example, where the different people involved, the different people need to cooperate in order to achieve that shared goal, where there is no power hierarchy between different groups that come from different enclaves. So, in race relations, to have groups from different races, racial identities that are actually on an equal playing field in terms of one doesn't report to the other, and they have to cooperate to solve a problem. So it's actually, it's an interesting way to think about a recipe for not just the space, but the people that are in that space, the power dynamics between them, and having some purpose that goes beyond individually. So there's a set of ingredients, and one of the things that, in general, when I look around the world, where could we create those opportunities? Or where is there a clear value if we could just structure things differently? It tends to be in the in the local context, right? So there's a lot of the ideological warfare and the polarization is actually coming from above, kind of what's happening in DC, what's happening, across the national media. On the ground in a local context, often if we did have that ability to come into contact with one another, to worry about our schools or the water we all drink or other things that actually affect our everyday lives, I think we'd find plenty of demand and value in creating those environments and having that kind of, but there's a kind of minimal requirement if you wanted to kind of look for contact theory in the wild that we would want to create.
Yeah.
Well, you mentioned a recipe. I wonder if we could list some ingredients.
Yeah.
What is that recipe?
Yeah, happy to. I'm going to do it in a story, though. I wrote a book that's for sale here, if I can have a shameless plug for a moment, called The Way Out, How to Overcome Toxic Polarization, and it essentially looked at the science under which deeply divided societies that either had tipped into civil war or were about to actually didn't, and stopped and pivoted and came out. And what we basically have done is gleaned sort of 5 ideas or principles for this set of levers that you can use to escape this. So I published this book in 2021. Then last summer, I was reflecting on my own life and realized that I don't always walk my talk, right? So I live on the Upper West Side of Manhattan in New York City. There's a neighbor I have that I've grown up with. I've known him for about 15 years. I've seen him. He's a father and a grandfather and seems like a decent guy, and we've chit-chatted. And then about 2 years ago, he started to talk to me about his politics, which are insane. And I, at some point just said, I'm out. I don't want to talk about what a great figure Vladimir Putin is. I can't do this. So I withdrew. And then last summer I thought, I can't do this. I'm supposed to be good at this, right? So I then decided, okay, I'm going to try this. And I emailed my neighbor. And based on these kind of 5 principles that we've sort of generated from how societies escape these traps, I tried them. And I said, first of all, I emailed him and said, would you go for a walk with me outside? And so, I've never emailed him before, so there was a pause, and he wrote back and said, happy to meet with you, but like a walk, like what's up with that? And are you CIA? And are you worried about surveillance? And so he went down this very paranoid trap, right? Which makes sense, right? Nevertheless, I said, there's a point to this, I'll explain it to you. And so the first thing I had to do was be clear on what do I want to do here, right? Because it would easily have been a conversation where he'd say something that triggered me, and I said that's ridiculous, and here are the facts, and he'd say, and then we're off to the races, and I know where that goes, right? So I asked myself, what's the point? And this is, I think, an important principle, is where you start. How do you set up and be clear on what you hope to do? And what I said to myself is, look, this is an adamant supporter of Donald Trump. I want to understand. How does that happen? What's going on there? I really want to understand. So that was my goal. And one of the things we've learned from neuroscience that isn't something we're very good at in peace building, but we're getting better at, is to integrate movement. When you get stuck in an attitude or a belief or a system, not only getting up and moving yourself, like closing the door and dancing to music like an idiot for 5 minutes, helps loosen you up, but moving together outside, side by side, with people you disagree with, there is a physiological reaction. It's actually kind of a neurological reaction where you connect. When you do that outside, it's very different from sitting across a table from somebody and seeing them as the problem. You're now traveling together. So we went for a walk outside. And we started with dialogue. We started by saying, who are you? Where do you come from? What's your history? And it was, informative. I learned a lot about this person and where they came from and where their values are rooted. And then he asked the same question, and I shared my background. We have some commonalities, and that was helpful. And then we moved into politics, and I said, please explain to me, how you support Donald Trump.
And I want to interrupt you real quick. Did
Yeah.
you tell him that the point of this was to eventually talk about politics? Or was that sort
Yeah.
of a sneaky sort of, by the way?
No. He knew from the beginning. He said, I'm assuming you want to talk to me because you don't know any Republicans that support Donald Trump. And I said, yeah, you're right.
All right.
So we walked into that, yes. But then again, I just said, can you explain this to me? And that's an important frame that I want to share because there's research on this. And then he went into it. And he had all of the talking points from Breitbart and Fox News and the New York Post, and he went through all of them. And my objective was not to challenge him, counter him. It was to try to understand. So I listened. I asked clarifying questions. So this is really, you really believe this? Okay, fine. And went on. What happened was kind of fascinating, and it wasn't really what I expected. He, for about 25 minutes, had this tirade. And I listened, and, I didn't agree. I just listened and clarified. And then at some point, what happens when you ask people to explain their point of view on complicated things, if you don't engage in the dance with them, they come to their own conclusions, their own doubts, their own... They start to understand that they're not sure. And there are things that they actually don't understand. Do I know? Should I be better informed? Yeah. Do I think this person should run for office again? Probably not. Right? So he got there himself. And I just was with him for the ride. And that's an important component. I reset. I thought about the kind of best ways to do this, which is to begin with listening to each other and learning and humanizing each other a little bit. I knew him to be a good person from watching him. He reminded me of that in his stories. Then I allowed him to kind of explain his way into his own uncertainties and doubts. And then we, eventually went back to the apartment. At first, when we first met, he said, my wife's not feeling well, I got to be back there in about 45 minutes. I said, okay, no problem. And then when we started to walk back, he's like, oh, we can walk a little longer. It's okay. So we talked a little longer. And then we got back to the apartment building, and I happened to have a copy of my book and said, I just want you to know, you don't have to read it. But this is why I asked you to do this. I just want you to have a sense of that. And we rode the elevator, and he looked at me and he said, yeah, polarization, this is a bad time. And I don't know what to do about this, because he said, I too get lost in the forest all the time. And I said, I think all we can do is what we tried to do, which is try to keep in communication. So the one thing I'll say is, did that solve everything? Absolutely not. But it loosened me up, it loosened him up, and we've had multiple conversations since. And that's the beginning of a dynamic that's going to take time, right? This is about cultural change. This is not about individual attitude change. But that's one way to do it.
I want to pull something out from that story. There's many gems in there, but one is the opportunity to be confronted with your own opinion. When someone asks you about it curiously, and you are then matching the dots in your head that you've not really been asked that often to match in front of a witness.
Yeah.
And it's really remarkable that sometimes it's the dialogue with yourself that can be as powerful as the dialogue you think you're having with another person. So, Deb, I'm curious, what ingredients have you seen in your work that would compound on what Peter's been talking about?
Yeah, I think it sort of relates to part of Peter's story, but one of the things that is fundamental to the work we've been doing, and really lessons learned from, we call these one of the ancient wisdoms that has been rediscovered in cultures around the world, where you have difficulty in agreement around some contentious issue. It seems like the most natural thing is to get to those opposing opinions, but to actually shift the conversation to ask about people's experiences. And it may be a story, it might just be an experience you've had that will often typically be imbued with your view of the world, so your perspective, and certainly your opinions will come through as well. But it's fundamental to the approach we've adopted in the work we now do with partners around the country. And it's not an obvious thing, where if you are trying to move forward on some issue, and you can go in direction A or B. What should we do about the curriculum in our schools, right? And we have the option of keep this in place or remove it. It seems most natural to go to people who are going to be involved and ask them directly, should we do A or B? And then the opinions will come out. And the thing that, and I'd ask everyone here to just sort of reflect for a moment and see whether this rings true at all, that a lot of the opinions that we hold are not our own, that we pick them up from elsewhere.
Yes.
Especially for issues which are complex or maybe distant, like, what's all of our opinions on what's happening in various, foreign affairs. A lot of us don't have direct connection, and yet we feel like they are our opinions, and the moment they're attacked, we feel like we're being attacked, and we
That's
go
right.
into this kind of fight mode. A second thing is, actually, a lot of opinions we don't have at all, but when asked, we on the fly construct them. And as soon as we hear them, we feel ownership over them. So there's also a lot of studies that look at how unreliable and unstable opinions actually are. So when you think about that, and then think about the whole field of public opinion, which is actually a kind of foundational element of democracies, right? Polling and surveys and focus groups are all generating essentially compilations of opinions. So the practice of redirecting and saying, whatever the issue is, what's an experience that you've personally had that relates to that issue? Or even more open-endedly, hey, we're, just to kind of set the table, an open-ended prompt we've used now with thousands of people is, what is a hope or a concern you have about life in your community today, and as you look ahead, just the next couple of years, don't talk about, abstract futures. And whatever that hope or concern is, it's the next question which is key, which is, what's an experience you've had that brought you to that hope or that concern? And is extraordinary people who are ready for a fight, your body language changes, right? And it opens the path to building mutual respect and trust and empathy. In fact, there are a growing number of empirical studies when you do kind of side-by-side comparisons of what happens when people across political divides share opinions in very civil and rational ways, and facts to support their opinions, and look at the effect it has on mutual respect. Mutual respect often goes down. And instead, if you ask people to share their experiences as it relates to that politically charged issue, guns, abortion, immigration, you name it, mutual respect goes up, even if the experience clearly indicates they're coming from a different perspective than you and don't agree. So so there's a lot of evidence and there's a lot of ancient wisdom that's a way to kind of pivot into a place where, something you said in passing in the opening, which is, it is so important to be able to see and hear the humanity in others. If we don't, I kind of sometimes use this analogy of a kind of taut social fabric that we're all standing on. And with that firm ground, we can debate, and we can argue, and we can fight, and let the best ideas win, and commit to democratic norms that our side and our position won't always win, and it's okay because there'll be another day. But if that social fabric starts to fray, and we stop seeing and hearing that humanity in others, and don't have the basic dignity and mutual respect, then there's no point in focusing on the fight, because there's no foundation. Yeah. And so hearing experiences versus opinions. And I just kind of wanted to elaborate on this point because it's neither intuitive, and when you know there's a decision to be made, it seems like a waste of time. Why are we talking about hopes and concerns and experiences? Your personal experiences are idiosyncratic, and we need to get a decision on A versus B. So it seems like that's where you should go. And so it's making that shift and realizing the space changes. Yeah. And eventually, if a hard decision needs to be made, to know that your experience and your perspective has been heard and considered is fundamental to, is the decision that opposes what you wanted to happen going to be viewed as legitimate? And if we lose legitimacy in that process, then it doesn't matter how.
Yeah, I so agree with that, because the social fabric is something we take for granted, the strength of that social fabric, and it's being tested right now. So yeah. I want to move us, oh, and by the way, in about 10 minutes, we'll do some Q&A, so get your questions ready. I want to introduce a scenario. Let's say that two friends disagree on abortion pretty vehemently and have some passionate views on it. They avoid talking to each other about it. They know they disagree, but they really haven't ever gotten into it with each other. And it comes up. It just sort of comes up. Now, pause. What is the next step? If this is going to be a constructive conversation, what should one of them say or do to kick it off?
Good scenario. And so in the way out in the book, I begin with a conversation with 6 women from Boston that came together to talk. There were 3 pro-life and 3 pro-choice advocates, lifelong advocates in Boston, who came together after a shooting in 1994 that had taken place in Brookline to talk to each other, even though they believed that the other side was evil, right? They believed that they were the enemy. And they did this, and they did it intentionally, and it was extremely difficult, these conversations, and profoundly important to them in their lives. 25 years later, those 6 women are close friends. They still disagree on the principle of abortion, but they found so many commonalities and so much respect for one another that it radically transformed who they are. So I recommend that story, but let me just say a couple of things. So one is, if you have tried to have this conversation before with somebody who you fundamentally differ on something important to you, and it's gone nowhere or it's gone bad, try to take a walk. Start there. Again, it's a simple thing.
So if they're sitting for coffee, be like, you know what, let's get some fresh air.
Get the heck out of here. I'll get the check, and let's take a walk. Ideally, outside, side by side, it is a step up on this, and that can help sort of just change the dynamic, that it's not us and them, where you can get a little bit more nuanced and into the honesty of it. The other thing I want to say, though, and I wanted to make this point, but this is really interesting research. It was done by a man named Emile Bruneau, who was a neurologist, neuroscientist who died a few years ago, but he studied dialogue. And he studied dialogue across power differences. So what if you are an Israeli or a Palestinian, right? And in that case, high power Israeli, low power Palestinian. Or in Arizona, he studied dialogues between citizens and illegal immigrants, and there's a power dynamic there. And he was interested in what moves the needle for them in these dialogues. And what they found was that 2 things matter in these conversations where you're hearing each other. One is that you hear them, and the other is that you be heard, that your story be heard. And what they found is that there are differential effects if you're a powerful person or a less powerful person. If you're a powerful person, what's really important to you being affected and changing your attitude is that you shut up and listen. Because people listen to you all the time. They listen to you all the time. You don't tend to do that. So if you actually can take in their information, it affects you. If people are in low power in a struggle, they need to be heard, right? That's really critical. And if they feel like you really are listening and understanding, it moves the needle for them. So these things are critical things that can happen in these conversations. But that distinction about, like, are you just peers or friends? Or is there a power dynamic here? Is it a mother and daughter?
So I have to ask, in that scenario, because it's a fascinating one, what if the powerful person, and let's just say that that's an objective truth, but who knows?
Right.
What if they don't feel like the powerful person in that moment? What if they don't think they're the ones that need to do more listening?
Doesn't matter as long as they're listening. If they take it in, then it has an impact on the low power person, right? So the definition of who's more powerful or less powerful, it's a complicated thing. Power is all over the place.
You don't need to establish that going in.
Yeah, you don't have to say, okay, let's be clear here, right? But this is an important issue, and it's an important dilemma in the bridge building world, that so we can come together and agree, but what about the profound injustices that are happening to my people? What about that? And that has to be factored into how are these conversations useful in moving people forward to agreeing to continue the conversation.
So Deb, yeah, what would you advise the people in that scenario, and take that where you will?
Yeah, I think just to maybe shift the scenario a little bit and think about, because one of my concerns, going back to this notion of, can we create the spaces that enable these kinds of crossing of divides at scale? Because I worry about how much energy it does take, even at that individual level, for two people who know they disagree to go for a walk. I was thinking, I grew up in Winnipeg. It's like frozen cold half the year. Does that mean half the year things deteriorate, and when it warms up, we actually go for, but there's a lot of effort in creating these. One of the things that, so I'll just say briefly, because I mentioned technology at the beginning, that we've been thinking a lot about tapping into the power of digital technology to create these kinds of spaces, and then tap into these ancient wisdoms. One of which is, if you have a difficult challenge, whether it's those two individuals, there's probably people who have shared experiences that might see themselves as on two sides of the divide. Bringing people that already trust one another and have some shared experience together, and having a sharing experiences in that context, and being able to then lift parts of those experiences and cross-pollinate, have exposure. What I've just described there is, I think, an interesting model for a kind of mediated environment that is very different than social media, right? Where, and it's not, what happens in social media, which is the most extreme, polarizing, provocative voices get amplified because they get rewarded the way these platforms are designed. They're just looking for signals that create a kind of engagement and where people can't take their eyes off the spectacle. It's a very different kind of content than what flows in these small trusted circles. That could be a very different source of how we get exposure to people that perhaps we will never come directly into contact, or for each scenario where there is a way to bring those two people together and set the right context, there may be many more contexts where you can essentially talk with others that have similar perspectives, knowing and giving permission or consent to be overheard by others, right? And that I think we should be designing structures like that. We've been doing work, I work at MIT, we're both in academic environments where accusations of wokeism and other cultural tensions are really tearing apart the social fabric of our communities, 25,000 students, staff, and faculty. Crazy power dynamics, between students, staff, and faculty. A couple of years ago, in an open meeting with the president of MIT, a member of staff said, yeah, there's a power dynamic here. It's faculty, research staff, students, administrators, furniture, and then support staff, right, was placed at the bottom. And just in terms of the kind of power hierarchies at play, so how do you actually have authentic conversations where there are problems in a space like that? So, the reason the president of MIT asked us to bring our tools and methods in, without going into the details, was to create that kind of a communication space where administrative staff could have private conversations with themselves, amongst themselves, share experiences where those in that small conversation will commiserate, rather than ask a bunch of challenging questions of how could that be, or eyeball rolls of just like, or just total not understanding. So having those contexts where you do feel like you belong and can share, but then creating opportunities for that to be sort of overheard or kind of heard by others.
And brought to the larger conversation.
Yeah, and interestingly, those that were in power, when there's kind of accusations of this kind of woke or sort of, DEI going too far on college campuses, some people feel that way, and they don't feel like they can talk about it.
Yeah,
right?
absolutely.
And so actually those that were in power suddenly feel like they can't speak up. And so creating those spaces where you have a more scalable version, at the scale of thousands of people, right?
It's a challenge. It's messy. Well, with that, I want to move us on to questions. So please wait until a microphone gets to you. So let's start up here in front. Yep. And hold on, we need a microphone. And if you could just say your first name too, and then your question.
Hello, my name is Priyanka Gupta, and I'm from the Basis Scholar Foundation, or Scholars Program. And my question is, I would say, like, when I go to sleep, I usually, like, replay conversations from my friends, like, from 5 months ago, and just say, oh, I should have said that. Or some things that, like, that keeps you up at night about, like, what's your AI project with the social media, or just what we talked about today.
Can I just clarify?
What was the question?
Question, yeah, sorry.
What keeps you up at night?
Oh, okay.
Oh, interesting. What keeps you up at night on this topic? Who wants
I'll
to?
tell you very quickly, and this is provocative, but Civil War in the United States. So John Meacham, Doris Kearns Goodwin, serious historians of America. Barbara Walter has written a fantastic book called How Civil Wars Start. She's a CIA analyst that studied instability around the world and when civil wars break out. To a person are saying, we're on that trajectory. The conditions are very parallel to 1850 in America, and what Walter is saying is that civil war is not going to be what it was. It's not going to be muskets on a field in uniforms. It's going to be organized militias taking out power substations around the country. And on Christmas Day, in 5 states in the US, there were multiple power stations simultaneously targeted and taken out by militias. So this is something that's happening in this country. There's a rise in hate crimes, there's a rise in political violence, and there's a rise in these, what they call stochastic terrorism, which just means that the rhetoric is at a place where it increases the odds that people that are willing to do this are going to do this. That's what keeps me up. And that's why we have to be able to hold 2 ideas in our heads in the same place. One is we have to fight for what we believe is right, and we have to learn how to do it in ways that are nonviolent and civil.
That's right. That's right. Thank you. All right, so for the sake of getting more questions, yes, let's go to the back, right there next to you. Yes.
Hi, thank you so much. I'm actually very excited to ask my question, given that answer.
And can you say your first name too?
Yeah, my name is Laila Hassan. I'm an independent investigative reporter, and I actually cover far-right extremism. And so I wanted to ask, what is the media's role in this larger discussion, in that we have a responsibility to inform about the rise of extremism, but we don't necessarily want to contribute to future polarization?
Right.
Deb, you want to take that?
Sure. I think, in doing the work to reflect the everyday perspectives and lives of what is really the majority of people that would be your kind of addressable audience, versus having there's a larger system that the media both is contributing to and trapped in, which is, we were talking this morning over breakfast, there's a concept of the Overton window, which is, in media studies, essentially for any given issue, if there's a kind of range of positions you can take, what is the acceptable range outside of which it's kind of considered taboo or fringe? And over the, really with the internet and with social media, the Overton window and kind of what is acceptable has just expanded, and we're just saying over breakfast, and not only has it expanded, so what used to be fringe or kind of extreme views are now permissible in the public's dialogue and media, but actually most of the attention has moved into the extremes. So just as a general comment, being able to bring the journalism and the dealing with the issues back into the middle. And I don't mean the political middle, I just mean in terms of the kind of extreme range versus where actually most people's lives are being lived. And if you go back to that question of how does this issue intersect with your personal experience, if the journalism can reflect the same level of kind of attention as you'd get from, if you did the thought experiment, ask 330 million people that question, what fraction of the energy would be in these extremes? Very, very little. So there is a kind of, there's a phrase some people use, nut picking, when you want to report on that other side, find the extreme nut and amplify them. Pick that, right? Social media is just wired to do that. It does that for free. The media and the journalism and the editorial controls you actually have control over that. The problem is the same business logic that drives social media. It's the original business logic of the media. And so there's a challenge. If you're in the nonprofit media, there are certain things you can do that are, possible, but so it depends on also the organization.
The economics of it, totally. And I want to try to get 2 more questions in if we can in 5 minutes.
Can I just make one recommendation, though? And you maybe are familiar with this, but there's a movement in journalism called Complicating the Narrative, which started with a colleague of ours, Amanda Ripley, and the Solutions Journalism Group. And that's what they've been doing now for 3 years, is trying to understand how does reporting and the business model of reporting contribute to polarization, and how can they go about reporting? What are alternative strategies that are still a viable business model, but that don't oversimplify and only look at extreme outrage cases, but that really capture the complexity of these issues that are oftentimes being covered. So that's...
Yeah, +1 on Solutions Journalism Network. Let's go right here on the side. Can we get a microphone right there? Yep, thank you.
Hey there, I'm Brian Kaiser from North Carolina. Social media has definitely conflated who I am with what I believe. Everyone wants to belong to a tribe. I mean, I think someone cited earlier that hearing someone's viewpoint on one issue, you can probably predict how they feel about every other issue, because there's some homogeneous thing going on there. So in these discussions that you guys have been advocating, how can you advise, because these tribes don't accept nuance, and they cast out people. People want to belong. So in these dialogues, what do you advise that give people safety in feeling like I can change my frame of mind without losing my sense of belonging to the tribe I associate with?
Yeah, great question.
Your belonging assessment, or you've taken one.
So I'll make a pitch for one of the things we realize is that nobody reads books anymore. So last year we created a challenge, which is a 4-week kind of experiential thing. It's on a website by a group called Starts With Us, which is a nonprofit that deals with depolarization. And basically, if you sign up for it, it encourages you every day to do one thing. It can be 5 minutes, it can be longer. It gives you some options. First week, you look at you and your inclinations and attitudes and tendencies and reflect on that. The second week, importantly, is that you look at the group that you're comfortable talking about politics with. Because what's happened in this country with the divisions is that we're not really honest anymore with our own people, right? We're not honest about our own ambivalence and concerns about positions that our politicians are taking. We feel there's no space for that. So how do we do that? And there's a week-long set of activities about how do you introduce some candor and honesty into your experience with those who share your values, but really be honest about that, because that's a critical component to eventually getting to a place where you're not reacting to each other as tribes, but you're allowing for nuance within your own conversation. So it's at the Starts With Us website. It's called the Political Courage Challenge. Just go to the second week if you're interested and start there.
I want to add something and actually respond to what keeps me up at night, which is, and then what to do about this kind of tribal mindset that is being reinforced basically by the air we breathe. That what keeps me up at night is the problems we're dealing with have been decades in the making. It's going to take time to resolve them, and that we get trapped in a kind of short-term thinking, and when things get worse, because I believe they're going to get worse before they get better, that we haven't placed enough of our bets on long-term results. So kind of having our collective energy. You're all here because you care about this issue. Whatever you're going to do about it, that you not put all of your energy into things that matter between now and November 5th, 2024, or whatever your short-term view is, because there's going to be life the day after and so forth. So investing in our youth, I think is so important. And then to this question around, there are all these, I think, great initiatives, but in general, revitalizing and bringing into the 21st century of social media and generative AI and whatever comes next is our civic education. And I think in many ways, I look to young people not just as the future and therefore need to learn, but we're going to learn from them, because people who have been born into this understand the affordances, and as the affordances of technology keep shifting, which is mediating so much of what we're doing, how do you think about kind of civics education program in the high schools, even younger, in colleges? I work at MIT, I've been talking to my colleagues at Harvard. Where is that civics kind of program that allows the fish to get out of the water and think about what we're swimming in? Think about these different skills and how we can bring them into the environments and the tools that we use every day. That kind of a reboot. We need it.
So with that, I'm afraid to say we are out of time for this session, but we're going to be around, right? We're around. So come find us. Let's keep the conversation going, and let's start many, many more. So thanks, everybody. Thanks to Peter and Beth.